We're going to continue our discussion now talking about insectivorous plants. Insectivorous plants, you'll notice that they're green. They have chlorophyll. They do not eat the insects primarily as a food source for the glucose they need to live. They eat the insects for chemicals and other aspects that they need to live other than an energy source. Now on the right here is called a pitcher plant, and what this part of the plant down at the bottom here has material that's insects like, and what happens is the insect comes up, gets up here, and goes down in here and gets stuck and eventually dies, and that's how he gets in trouble. Now over here we have a Venus flytrap. Everybody knows what happens is that the insect lands in this area. There's something in here that's attractive to the insect. It lands in this area, and then this closes and the insect can't get out. We're going to spend some time now talking about the different ways that plants reproduce. The first of these is called a runner. The first group of these is called vegetative reproduction. And the first type of vegetative reproduction is called a runner, which is essentially a long stem that runs above the ground and eventually comes to a point where it can take root. And when it takes root, it produces another plant. Now, both of those plants are genetically identical. So here's what runners look like. Here's one plant. This grows along, and then there's another spot on this runner. It sets down roots, and out come another plant. And then it goes to the next point. And eventually, the runner part breaks, and the plants become independent. Now, you can actually, many times on the runner, you can identify where on the runner the next new plant will grow, and you can purposely put that in the ground, and it will grow faster. You can also tie or place that section in a glass container with nutrient growth, and it will germinate. Not a good word to use for that, but it will put down roots and produce a plant right there when you put it in the water. Now on this side we have the grafting. And grafting is when you take the stem of one plant and put it into a stem of another plant, and they grow together. And as this shows, there are two parts. The stem that's attached to the new plant is called the scion, and the parent plant, the one that accepts the stem, is called the stalk. These two are brought together and then taped up like this, and then over a period of time this unites one to the other, and you end up with a new branch on this. As it shows here, one of the most common plants that are associated with runners is strawberries. Now let's spend some time talking about the sexual reproduction of plants. And in order to understand that, we have to understand the anatomy of the flower. We haven't talked about the anatomy of the flower yet, so I'm going to spend some time going over that over the next few slides. The first part of the flower is the part of the stem that holds up the flower, and it's called the pedicel. And right here is where the pedicel is. The next part are the leafy structures that are above the pedicel that kind of at one time or another probably encased all of the flower, and they open up and out the flower comes. And these are the little leafy structures that are called the sepals. Then, of course, the things that we always know about are the petals, which are the colorful leaf structures above the sepals right here. And then the male and female reproductive organs, many flowers have both. The male reproductive organ is called a stamen, and this whole section here from here all the way up to here is one stamen right there. And then the other is called a carpel. It's also sometimes called a pistil, P-I-S-T-I-L. And it's right in this area right here. So from here down to here is the carpel. So you have the pedicel, the sepals, the petals, the stamen, there are two here, and the carpel or pistil right here in the middle. Now let's look at another, and we're going to break down the stamen and the pistil or the carpel into its component parts. So the stamen is made up of two parts: the filament, which is the part from here down to here. So it's the lower part of the stamen. And then the other part is called the anther. And the anther is up here. And it is the part that contains the pollen grains. The pollen grains are the haploid cells that function as sperm. Now the carpel or pistil is made up of the stigma, which is here at the top, a tube-like structure called the style here, and its purpose is to hold this up near the anthers so that pollination is quite simple. And then down here is where the embryo actually is, and this is called the ovary. And this inside part is called the ovule. Inside here, the whole section here is called the ovary. It's right there. Now, flowers can come either as perfect, which are the two diagrams I showed you below. Both of those flowers contained both stamen and carpels. Those are called perfect flowers. Imperfect flowers have either a carpel or a stamen. And you'll notice that they've used the word pistil here instead of carpel. Carpel is the more modern term. Pistil is the older term. And if a flower is an imperfect flower and it contains only stamen, like this, it's called a staminate flower. And if it contains only carpels or only pistils, it's called a pistillate flower. And then below here is something called the receptacle. And the receptacle is the tip of the pedicle. You remember that this part down here that holds the flower is called the pedicle. Well, the tip of that is called the receptacle. Now, flowers can come as simple flowers, which are shown here, or they can be called composite, which is the fact that something that appears to be a single flower is actually made up of multiple small flowers, all in a single receptacle. And the classic example of a composite flower is the sunflower, which is actually thousands, literally thousands of flowers in one receptacle. Now, when we talk about how pollen is formed, you start out on the anther. Let me go back to that. Here on the anther, there's something called a pollen sac. And the pollen sac is where the diploid cells occur that end up undergoing meiosis and forming pollen. And so once meiosis occurs, there's two meiotic divisions and you end up with 4 haploid cells. And the 4 haploid cells are called microspores. And the microspores are then encased inside a thick coat that protects the microspore, and one of the nuclei of the haploid cells becomes generative and the other nuclei becomes what's known as the tube nucleus. So each pollen grain ends up, after all these divisions occur, with 2 nuclei. One haploid nuclei, which is the generative nucleus, one haploid nuclei, which is the tube nucleus. And in a second, I'll show you how these two are important. These reside inside a fairly thick coat. And this entire thing here is called a mature pollen grain. On the female side, in the carpel, you form something called a megaspore. And a megaspore is the result of meiotic divisions that start with the egg, and you end up with a single egg and 3 polar bodies. And then ultimately you end up with 4 nuclei on each side here. And the nuclei, there's an egg cell and then something called the polar nuclei. And this right over here is what's known as the megaspore, this structure here. And one of these nuclei will end up becoming the endosperm, and the other ends up becoming the fertilized plant. So this whole thing here is called a embryo sac, and it contains all haploid cells. So let's look at what happens when pollination occurs. This is pollination. You start out with pollen from the anther here, and it moves or gets transported over to the stigma of the carpel. And when that occurs, the pollen forms what's called a pollen tube. The pollen tube reaches down. The pollen tube comes from the tube nucleus of the pollen grain, and it transports the sperm nucleus down here into this part down here, and you end up with a fertilized egg nucleus. And the fertilized egg nucleus ultimately becomes the embryo, and then the other part becomes the endosperm. So you start out, the whole process is called pollination. The transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of the carpel is called pollination. The 2 sperm cells actually come down in through the sperm tube. One hits the egg nucleus, one hits one of the polar nuclei, one forms the embryo, and the other forms the endosperm. The endosperm will function as a food source for the embryo. This is absolutely unique. Double fertilization does not occur in animals. As I said, the pollen tube is important for transfer of the sperm to the embryo and to the polar nuclei. And the endosperm is what's formed when the polar nuclei unite with a sperm cell, and it ends up being the food source for the developing embryo. So here we have the makeup of the normal seed, and the seed coat on the outside is called the Tesla. And this is just the coating around the outside of the seed that covers the seed. The seed itself is a ovule that has this protective coat called the Tesla. So once you have this formed, this is what's known as a seed. And inside here you have the food source, which comes from the endosperm, and the embryo itself. Now, on the outside of a seed, many plants will form a fruit. And the fruit is just a mature ovary that has a seed in, or seeds inside. Now, fruits can be simple, which means they have a single flower that forms a single fruit. They can be aggregate, which is a single flower that has multiple parts. Or they can be multiple, which is multiple flowers resulting in a single fruit. So a simple fruit is a fruit that forms from a single ovary. A compound fruit is either one of these two. It's a fruit that forms from multiple ovaries. Aggregate is a single flower with multiple ovaries. And multiple are multiple flowers with multiple ovaries. Now this diagram is a review diagram, and you might want to look at this in a little bit of detail. There's essentially two kinds of fruit. There are fleshy fruits, which are up here, and the fleshy fruits are the palms, drupes, and berries. And then the dry fruits, which are basically the rest. And you can see there are various names for dry fruits, samara, akene, and all of these names are also in your book. And you need to look at those because I may give you a few examples on the quiz for those different kinds of fruits. Now I wanted to use this diagram to point out the various parts of the seed. The lower portion of the plant embryo, which eventually becomes the root, is called the radicle, and it's right here. The middle portion of the embryo that becomes the stem is called the hypocotyl, and it's right in this part. The seed leaves are shown here, and they're large and they store food for the plant. And that's right there. And then the epicotyl is the top part of the embryo that forms the leaves. And it's that whole part there. Now each of those little leaf-like structures is called a plumule. And those are the things that form the true leaves in the embryo. So once germination is told to happen, the first thing that happens is you have the hypocotyl breaks through the seed coat, and at the same time the radicle begins to burrow down in to the ground and form initial rooting. At the same time, the hypocotyl's right here, and it begins to move up this way as the root moves down into the ground. And it eventually will pull the seed out of the ground, the cotyledon of the seed. Once it's out of the ground, the leaves here, and this diagram is of a dicot, so it has two seed leaves. They split, and the plumules begin to come out like this. And so you end up with the hypocotyl here, the epicotyl here, and the plumules that form the leaves. Now the epicotyl and the plumules can perform photosynthesis. So once they get exposed to the light, they begin to produce plant food for the plant.